It makes a great pub quiz question. When and where was the first America's Cup race? The obvious answer is here in the Solent in 1851, in a race that started from the now legendary start line off the Royal Yacht Squadron. But that's not technically correct. The £100 trophy that was put up by the Royal Yacht Squadron and won by the Yacht America was indeed raced for here in 1851, before heading across the Atlantic to New York. But the first America's Cup match didn't happen until 19 years later. But even then, it took a while to get going. And this is where it moved to for 132 years, before exploding onto the international scene. This is how the America's Cup began and why it's so big today. Whatever point in history you look at, the America's Cup is famous for its yachts. Throughout 173 years, they've all represented the leading edge of design and construction. So you may be asking why we're focusing on 2 yacht clubs. The answer's simple, and it can be found in the document that forms the basis of the America's Cup, the Deed of Gift. It's a short but superbly written document. At its heart, there's a paragraph that is especially important.
It is distinctly understood that the cup is to be the property of the club and not of the members thereof or owners of a vessel winning it in the match. The condition of keeping it open to be sailed for by yacht clubs of all foreign countries upon the terms above laid down shall forever attach to it, thus making it perpetually a challenge cup for friendly competition between foreign countries.
In short, you can win it, you can make the rules for the defence, but you can never own it. Brilliant.
Basically, the Deed of Gift is a notice of race, if you like, and it sets some parameters for how the cup should be sailed for. And it's a remarkably clever document because it sets out very clearly the detail you can look up, but 3 races, or best of 3 races. One is effectively what we would nowadays describe as a windward-leeward race. Another is a coastal race, like a short offshore, inshore, has to go around a headland. And then the third race, if required, is a sort of triangular course. And there's all sorts of other little parameters about length of the boat and draft of the boat. Draft of the boat being restricted because you have a coastal race. You don't want something with too shallow a draft because it could cut a corner. But where the document is really clever is it then, having set out all the rules, basically says, however, if the challenger and the defender choose to do something different, they're perfectly entitled to do that, provided they both agree. And that's a very important kernel to the relationship between a defender and a challenger of record.
The Deed of Gift was created by a syndicate led by the Commodore of the New York Yacht Club, John Cox Stevens, and club member George Schuyler. But it wasn't straightforward. It took 19 years before the first America's Cup race took place, a race that started here in 1870.
Well, I think this is a good time to mention a crucial point, which is that the America's Cup is a challenge trophy. In other words, it is a challenge-driven contest. It's not a regularly scheduled event like an annual regatta. The holder of the cup will send an invitation. In this case, the New York Yacht Club sent an invitation to 25 yacht clubs in 1857. Here's a kind of a list here. You can see there was the Royal Yacht Squadron of Cowes, got an invitation, Royal Cork of Ireland, but also ones in Russia too, like the Imperial Yacht Club of St. Petersburg, among others.
But that was 1857. I mean, that's a lot of pre-planning, isn't it? 1857, and the race took place in 1870.
Yeah. Because of the Civil War that intervened, and you had some how should I say, some financial turmoil with some of the countries, including America, during some of those intervening years, so a number of reasons.
So 1870, the race takes place. How many of the clubs that were invited turned up?
Good question. It was only the Royal Thames Yacht Club that participated in the 1870 match, because it was Ashbury who used the Royal Thames as his yacht club to deliver the challenge. As you know, this is a yacht club versus yacht club contest, not an individual versus individual person contest. And when the New York Yacht Club accepted the Royal Thames Yacht Club's challenge, it prevented any other foreign yacht club from challenging at that time. They had to wait till the contest was over.
And yet, I know in your book here on the next page, we've got a picture of, yes. Just shows, we've got a picture of, a rare picture of that very first race. Right,
this is very special because this is the oldest known photograph of an America's Cup yacht race. So this is the August 8th, 1870 race, the first defense of the America's Cup.
But there's a lot more boats in that picture than just the Defender and Challenger.
Indeed, because for that match, the New York Yacht Club interpreted the deed of gift in a way that kind of went off the script of what the donors intended. The donors intended that the America's Cup Challenge Trophy would be a 1 versus 1 contest, a duel. But the New York Yacht Club, there was so much enthusiasm to participate in this wonderful challenge from the Royal Thames Yacht Club that they decided in a meeting to have a fleet of their schooners meet the schooner Cambria, the Royal Thames yacht. In part because it was meant to, in some ways, evoke the spirit of when Yacht America took on and defeated 14 English yachts in that 1851 race.
So how did Cambria feel about that being presented with not just one person to beat, but an entire fleet?
Well, interesting enough, there was no complaints by Ashbury. In fact, he probably thought it'd be a wonderful way to give it a go. He was very, very confident in Cambria. Number one, she defeated Sappho, the American yacht around the Isle of Wight, and Cambria also defeated the yacht Dauntless, a New York Yacht Club boat, in a transatlantic race from Ireland to New York. So he was riding a tremendous wave of confidence. And I think he was almost excited to take on the fleet, because there was no negative words from his mouth about that arrangement.
So here it is. This is where the very first America's Cup was held, 1870.
Absolutely. It's exciting to be here because here it is, the venue where you had James Ashbury representing the Royal Thames Yacht Club of the United Kingdom taking on the New York Yacht Club. But Ashbury, as you know, faced 17 yachts of the New York Yacht Club defending the cup. Can you imagine, Matt, seeing 18 schooners 120 feet long, tacking back and forth towards the lower bay? I mean, it was a spectacle to behold. The race is a 38 statute mile course that you go into the wind, sailing to windward, out to the southwest spit, then on a reach out to the Sandy Hook light vessel. This is about 8 miles, and back, retracing it, finishing back at the clubhouse for a nice downwind finish. And where we're standing on right here, there were tens of thousands of spectators here on this ridge looking down amphitheater style at the fleet. And on the opposite side, you had more spectators on the Brooklyn side. And out there on the ocean, on a flotilla of spectator craft, 20,000 spectators greeted the competitors when they went out to the Atlantic.
It's amazing, isn't it? It's amazing to imagine that many people, particularly as so much effort goes in nowadays to our sort of big crowd pulling parts of sail, it being the America's Cup or the Olympics or round the world races and the likes. And we do get good showing, but nothing like that. It's extraordinary. Yeah. The other thing that makes me surprised actually to hear that number of people come up. This yachting, it was an elitist sport. It wasn't like the masses engaged in it themselves. It's not like going to a football match, isn't it? What drew them here? Why did so many people come to watch yacht racing?
I would say there was the sheer spectacle of seeing a fleet of fast schooners, but it was also the novelty of an international contest. I mean, it's highly unusual during these times in the 19th century, especially at a time when there weren't that many sports leagues to begin with, let alone an international contest. At the start of that race in 1870, it was an ebb tide, so all the boats which started at anchor were actually pointed towards Manhattan. So the sterns were facing to the south. When the gun went off, they raised their anchor. The boats spun around 180 degrees to then sail to windward towards the southwest spit. And the yacht Magic, she was the second to the smallest of the fleet. She apparently turned around with great dexterity, if you will, one of the first to spin around. And I think that helped her gain the edge for the entire race, actually. It was at this section of the lower bay when Yacht America began to show her true colors and her strength. And she started to catch up many of the yachts that were far ahead of her in this section of the lower bay. And in the end, she ultimately finished in fourth place, uncorrected time.
Pretty good for a 19-year-old boat.
Exactly. And this place is very much like the San Francisco 2013 America's Cup, because it's like an amphitheater style viewing of the yacht races.
Yeah, it's fascinating because when you come down here, you see, particularly from the Narrows there, you see how close people could get, and also what the view was all the way out to sea, to Sandy Hook, and then out further into the ocean.
The Narrows are narrow; they're only about a mile wide, and so there you go. Standing on the bluff overlooking the Narrows, you can see the grand fleet of 18 schooner yachts parade and tack to windward down towards the lower bay. I mean, it's fantastic.
And the outcome of that race was what? Who won?
Well, it's funny because on corrected time, the race was run on corrected time. Magic won. She actually won on elapsed time too, dominating. But 9 New York Yacht Club schooners defeated Cambria. Ouch. Yeah, on corrected time, including Yacht America, the old, granddaddy, if you will. She came in fourth. Yeah.
How did Ashbury feel about that?
Yeah, well, good question.
Is there any documentary?
No documentary, but I think he was quite embarrassed to have a yacht that was built in 1851, a yacht that was, 20 years old practically, defeat a brand new Cambria. I think he didn't feel too good about that.
So we talked about the mood in New York after 1851. What was the mood like having won it 19 years later, or what was now the America's Cup 19 years later?
Well, the race was witnessed by at least 100 to 200,000 New Yorkers. To give you an idea of the scale, the New York Stock Exchange closed early that day to permit its employees and traders to have a chance to get down there and watch the races.
Really?
Behind me on my left is the New York Stock Exchange. And then to my right is 23 Wall Street, which was long, for many years, the headquarters of J.P. Morgan and Company. The chief partner was J. Pierpont Morgan, who also served as the Commodore of the New York Yacht Club in the late 19th century. That building, in many ways, is inextricably linked to the New York Yacht Club because Commodore Morgan was one of the most important Commodores the club had in its entire history. He backed many campaigns for the America's Cup and won them too, including Columbia in 1901. This match, if you want to call it a match, it was 17 boats versus 1, did a couple important things, Number one, it set the precedent that the America's Cup would be run on a course that's approximately 38, 40 miles in length, This wasn't a race around Long Island, which is one of the proposals that Ashbury made, by the way. But think about it, if the New York Yacht Club accepted that, the race, I think the America's Cup would be a little bit more of a long distance race. But because of the fact that it was a 38-mile course, it set that standard for the courses being of that general length for many, many America's Cup going forward. The second thing that it did was it brought in tremendous public interest. The press loved it. People were betting large sums of money on the outcome. Spectators loved watching it. It was a wonderful diversion from their workday. And it made the America's Cup more than just a yacht race. It became a spectacle that many Americans and many people overseas loved to follow. But even as the century went on, the newspapers, the media loved covering the America's Cup. And when Marconi developed the wireless telegraph, did you know that the 1899 America's Cup was the first sporting event that was chronicled with wireless telegraphy?
Is that right?
Yep.
I didn't know that.
So Marconi had out here on the Atlantic, the races by then were held on the Atlantic off of Sandy Hook. Marconi had his ships with the equipment, sending wireless telegraphy and signals to a point in Sandy Hook out into Manhattan with live reporting. There was even, I think it was in Times Square, that had a big billboard with the yachts, Columbia and Shamrock, like little objects showing each of the boats and where they were positioned as they moved across the race course.
Really? You could be talking about a modern day event, couldn't you?
Exactly.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing.
The fact that you had 17 yachts versus the lone challenger being a lopsided contest, the New York Yacht Club reviewed its decision to do something like that, and they decided not to do that for the next match. So Ashbury challenged again in 1871, and the club decided to have only one boat take on the challenger, in this case Ashbury's Livonia. But they did reserve the right to select from their pool of yachts a boat that was, best suited for the conditions of that day. But nevertheless, 1 versus 1.
That's interesting, because then that's what we see, isn't it, over the next, whatever it was, 100 years actually, where the Defender trials were a bigger deal in the Challenger trials. Just if you challenged, you turned up. Nowadays, you have Challenger trials and no Defender trials.
Correct. So beginning in, just to be clear, so in 1876, that was the first time the club decided, well, we're going to select one boat to defend the cup, and that one boat shall be the defender for the whole match. There won't be any game played by, let's select a boat on the morning of each match that's best suited for the wind conditions. That was not fair either. They realized that.
One of the great frustrations, but also wonderful things about the America's Cup is, as the winner, you get to set the rules, and the Americans carried on winning. I mean, it does give, without a doubt. I don't think anybody would deny that it's a slightly skewed playing field, always in favour of the defender. But that's what makes it an even bigger challenge, and that is what makes the winning the sweeter, because once you get it, you should be able to defend it successfully. But it does change hands. Of course it does. And
it was there for a long time, wasn't it? I mean, the Cup was in the New York Yacht Club for 132 years.
Yeah, which is a fair. It'll do. Yes, it is. And but obviously we've seen, in relative terms, the Cup change hands much more frequently since then. But the sport has changed. There's also a greater sort of fluidity of designers and sailors internationally, and technology's moved on, which in my opinion is all very positive.
So the Royal Yacht Squadron was involved right from the very start. How often has the squadron been involved in a cup cycle?
Well, Barcelona will be our 10th challenge, which isn't actually that many when you think of the period of time that has elapsed, 173 years. So once every 17 years is probably a little less frequent than it should be or could be. But of course, the Cup nowadays is such a big financial commitment. We've been fortunate enough to have such fantastic backing now for the third Cup cycle for the Royal Yacht Squadron. So we're on a bit of a roll, and I think we just need to keep going until we get where we need to get to.
But it was in the match in 1881 when the New York Yacht Club decided to hold a Defender selection series. And that, Matt, was the most important development in helping the New York Yacht Club keep the Cup for so long, because it permitted the New York Yacht Club to choose from a variety of craft, some experimental, some conventional. It allowed the defenders to develop and hone their skills in anger when racing against each other for the right to defend. It also created a way to maintain institutional memory, where from one campaign to the next campaign, knowledge learned from the previous one could be passed on again and again to the New York Yacht Club defenders. So that's an advantage that the challengers did not have. Of course, the challengers from 1870 all the way up to 1962 came alone.
And they had to sail across the Atlantic.
And they had to sail across the Atlantic, which you lose time doing that. You had to you had to get your boat re-rigged once you get to New York or Newport, starting in the 1930s. They did not have the benefit of honing their skills against a strong competitor.
Every time that a challenger failed and America successfully defended, as they did for over 100 years, it became more and more the Holy Grail. I mean, now to win the America's Cup is massive. And one day, and I hope this time round, this club will win it, and it will be massive for the club. Yeah.
Having to sail across the Atlantic and take part in what is in effect an inshore race puts you at a disadvantage against boats that have been designed to just sail in an inshore race.
Yeah, that is a good point to an extent. I mean, that's more of you mentioned a point that's long been brought up, but there's no evidence of the challengers having, how should I say, a disadvantage in the fact that they were building a stronger yacht or a heavy yacht designed for Atlantic crossings. In fact, sometimes, in some cases, the British showed up with a much lighter vessel than the American Defender. I can give you some examples later. What the British often did, and I say British because they were usually the challengers in the 19th century, they would re-rig their racing yacht into a yawl, in some cases reinforce the hull before they made the transatlantic passage. Once they arrived at the venue in New York or Newport, they will re-rig the boat into a sloop, make her fully light again and in full racing trim. And it's important to note that Americans went over to England too. Like Vigilant went over to England. She was the winner of the 1893 race. She made it across the Atlantic fine, and she was able to compete there. The yacht Yankee, the J-class yacht Yankee, she went to England and raced in 1935, and she won many races. So I don't think the challengers were at a disadvantage, of crossing Atlantic itself from a standpoint of being forced to build heavier yachts. It was more like losing time.
Right.
That was more of the bigger issue.
That's really interesting. And how much would understanding the local conditions have played a part in that long-running winning streak.
Wonderful point that you bring up, because a very important advantage the New York Yacht Club had was the home field advantage, if you will. Right behind you, Matt, is Norton's Point over there and Gravesend Bay. In 1876, when yacht Madeline, the American Defender, and Countess of Dufferin of Canada were competing in the match, there was a flood tide coming in, and they were laboring to windward as they worked into the lower bay. But Madeline, the Defender, using their local knowledge, went and took relief in Gravesend Bay. And at Norton's Point, there was a clockwise eddy just north of it, and Madeline took that and just jetted out into the lower bay.
So she came
Right
into that bay,
right into the lower
and
bay.
then
And then they had a
shot out there.
substantial lead towards Sandy Hook.
Yeah.
And that was pretty much game over for the Canadians.
It must have been soul destroying for the Canadians, because
Yes.
to see someone pass in front of your bow, having
Right.
had a slingshot on the tide
Right,
out there, and
Indeed.
you'd know that there's not going to be a tactical advantage of the tide further out there.
exactly.
Pretty depressing.
Pretty depressing. Right. I would say that the New York Yacht Club defenders had a business-like approach to defending the Cup. General Charles J. Payne, who won the Cup for the New York Yacht Club from 1885 to 1887, 3 times in a row, he said that this international contest for the Cup is work, he said. It's work. Think about this. Here is a man who, on the eve of the 1885 match, looked at the deck of his yacht Puritan and said, you know, we need to lessen the weight. Take a 1/4 inch off of the deck. We gotta lighten the topsides. When the yacht was being measured, he was there as the boat was being measured, because again, the races were still run on corrected time at that time. His opponent, on the other hand, Sir Richard Sutton, was not present at the measurement of his own yacht. Where was he? He was enjoying the wonders of Niagara Falls. Okay. Puritan, again, was purely a race boat, and that's what Payne wanted. So there were no deck lights for beautiful lighting underneath. Okay. It was work. And I think that attitude and that approach was a key element in the New York Yacht Club's successful defense.
If you've got deep enough pockets to get involved, it's not just one cup quite often. People get hooked very quickly and spend an extraordinary amount of money, often failing. Why? Why do they get drawn back to it time and time again?
Look, it's been said that it's, you know, the America's Cup is a drug, and it is. I think that for a lot of wealthy backers of the Cup, and there have been many, they find it, and I can see why, absolutely gripping, because actually, ironically, the money isn't the currency. If you have 5, 6 teams, all of whom have vast budgets, they've all got enough money, then it's not money that is going to win the Cup for you. It's something else. And for people with a lot of money who've spent their lives making money, this is a different challenge. It's not a challenge that you can just write a check out and therefore win. You have to use other currencies. And I think that's what makes it an obsession to so many people. And no one likes to lose, and everyone wants to win. So you just keep going till you win.